You could tell Knox had once been a strong man, broad shoulders, steady hands, the kind of presence that made people feel safe. For over 30 years, he ran into burning buildings while others ran out. But lately, he struggled to carry the grocery bags from his truck to the front porch. It wasn't the weight, not really. It was his legs, mostly. They just didn't seem to move the way they used to. He first noticed it when he tripped stepping up the curb outside his daughter's house. No ice, no obstacle, just a missed step and a slow, awkward fall to his knees. Knox laughed it off at the time, brushing dirt from his pants and waving off concern. But when it happened again, this time inside his garage, he didn't tell anyone. That quiet fear, the kind he used to ignore on the job, now visited him when he climbed stairs or stood up from a chair too fast. Retirement was supposed to be easy. Long mornings with his coffee and the paper, afternoon walks, a little travel. But instead of freedom, Knox felt himself shrinking. Not in spirit, he was still Knox after all, but in strength. The same man who once carried unconscious strangers out of danger now hesitated to lift his own grandson. He didn't like to say it out loud, but inside he worried. Am I fading? The doctor called it sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss. A normal part of aging, she said. But there was nothing normal about feeling helpless. Knox didn't want to rely on canes or chairs with armrests. He wanted to get down on the floor and build Lego castles. To walk through the airport without needing help. He didn't need to be a hero anymore, but he still wanted to feel like himself. He tried eating more protein, chicken, eggs, beef, but it didn't seem to help much. He wasn't gaining strength. He still ached after yard work and felt stiff every morning. His daughter brought him a few multivitamins from the pharmacy, but he couldn't tell if they did anything at all. Knox began to wonder if this slow decline was just inevitable. Then came the moment that changed everything. One Saturday morning, Knox sat on the bleachers at his grandson's soccer game. Just standing up to cheer took effort. He watched a group of older men nearby laugh and stretch, one of them even jogging the perimeter of the field. They looked strong, healthy, present. One of them, Tom, used to work maintenance at the station. Knox waved him over, and after a few minutes of catching up, Knox finally asked, "How are you still moving like that?" Tom smiled and said, "I just started taking something different. Nothing fancy, not a pill, just added a couple of powders to my coffee every morning. That's all it took. Not a lecture, not a sales pitch, just one friend telling another, it helped me." That night, Knox went down the rabbit hole. He wasn't looking for a miracle, just something to help him feel a little more like himself. He stumbled onto some quiet research about muscle support powders, natural ones, used in senior recovery programs, not pills, no chemicals, just nutrients the body stopped producing or absorbing efficiently with age. The more he read, the more it made sense. Collagen for joints and tissue repair, Whey for muscle rebuilding, Spirulina for circulation and recovery. It wasn't hype, it was science his body had been quietly asking for. So he ordered all three, no expectations, just a small experiment. By the end of the first week, nothing major had changed, but Knox noticed he wasn't quite as stiff in the mornings. By week 3, he was getting up from chairs without holding on. Not always, but often. And by the end of the second month, something happened that almost made him tear up. He climbed the steps at the library, 2 at a time, not to prove anything, just because he could. That's when he realized it wasn't about building biceps or bulking up. It was about getting back his rhythm, his independence. Little moments like stepping out of the truck without bracing, standing in the kitchen without shifting weight, playing with his grandkids and not needing to sit down after 5 minutes. Now, every morning, Knox stirs a scoop of collagen into his coffee, adds Whey to his smoothie, takes Spirulina in a little shot of orange juice. It's become his quiet routine, as natural as brushing his teeth. And he doesn't brag about it, but he doesn't need to. People see it in how he moves, how he smiles, how he shows up. If you're over 60 and feeling like your strength is slipping away, this story isn't just about Knox. It could be about you or someone you love. Sometimes the biggest changes don't come from gyms or prescriptions. Sometimes they come from one small scoop. One quiet decision to say, not yet, I'm not done. For most of his life, Knox never gave his strength a second thought. It was just there, like his heartbeat or his breath. As a firefighter, he carried ladders, kicked down doors, hauled water hoses heavier than most people realized. His body wasn't something he had to think about, it was something he could always count on. But somewhere in his late 60s, that certainty began to slip. Not all at once, but quietly, like a slow leak you don't notice until the tire is nearly flat. It started with the little things. He found himself leaning on the table to push out of his chair. His knees made that familiar cracking sound each morning, but now they were slower to unlock. Carrying groceries left him winded. His once confident stride became a bit more cautious, especially on uneven ground. Knox chalked it up to getting older, a phrase people tossed around so often that it lost its meaning. But deep down, it bothered him, not just the physical change, the emotional one. The part of him that was used to being strong, now quietly questioning if that strength was slipping away for good. One morning, after nearly stumbling in the shower, trying to balance on one leg, Knox sat on the edge of the tub, breathless. It wasn't fear he felt, it was something else, a kind of grief. The realization that his body was no longer cooperating the way it used to. His hands rested on his thighs and he looked down at them, still broad, still solid, but softer now, slower. He whispered to himself, "What the hell's happening to me?" That same week, he visited his doctor. Routine checkup, nothing serious. But Knox decided to bring it up. "Doc, I don't feel weak, but I don't feel strong either. Is this just age?" The doctor, a kind man with silver at his temples, nodded gently. "It could be sarcopenia," he said. "Happens to all of us as we get older. We start losing muscle mass, sometimes as much as 1 to 3% a year after 60. Knox blinked. Sarcopenia. Sounded like a fancy word for what he already knew. His muscles were fading and no one had warned him. "But I still eat well," he replied. "I get some movement in. It's not like I've given up." The doctor leaned forward. "It's not about giving up. Your body simply doesn't absorb or use nutrients the same way it used to. Even with a good diet, your muscles might not be getting what they need." That conversation stayed with Knox. Not because it was shocking, but because it finally gave a name to what he was experiencing. It wasn't laziness, it wasn't weakness, it was biology. But more importantly, it was not final. That's what the doctor emphasized before he left. There are ways to slow it down, even reverse some of it, but you have to be intentional about giving your body what it needs in the form it can actually use. That line echoed in Knox's head the next few days. In the form it can actually use. He started to look back, really look at what had changed. Meals had become simpler. He wasn't eating poorly, but he wasn't getting as much variety. He wasn't stretching as often. And while he did some light walks, they weren't enough to challenge his muscles. But mostly, it was about rebuilding, and Knox realized he wasn't doing anything to actually rebuild the strength he'd lost. The worst part? No one had warned him this was coming. There were books and commercials and endless chatter about blood pressure and cholesterol. But muscle loss? That conversation rarely happened. And yet it was the one thing quietly stealing his freedom. Not in some dramatic collapse, but in those tiny, everyday moments. Needing help out of a chair, avoiding stairs, feeling too tired to play catch. He thought of his grandson, Liam, just 7 years old. A bundle of motion and joy. Liam didn't see Grandpa as old. He saw him as Knox, the one who always lifted him high, who made car engine noises when they played, who could turn a walk into an adventure. And Knox wanted to keep being that person for as long as he could. Not just for Liam, but for himself. That weekend, he sat in his garage with a notepad. No, he didn't drop a workout plan or count calories. Instead, he started writing down what made him feel alive. Walking without pain, lifting his own groceries, sleeping without waking up sore, taking Liam to the park and not needing to sit on the bench. Those weren't goals, they were memories he wanted to keep living. And that was the moment things began to shift, not overnight, not even clearly. But it started with awareness. Knox no longer saw his strength as something gone. He saw it as something that could be rebuilt, quietly, patiently, and with care. The doctor had said his body wasn't absorbing nutrients the same way, so Knox figured maybe it's time to give it a little help. He didn't rush into anything. Knox was never the kind of man to fall for fads, but he started reading, listening, watching what others over 60 were doing to stay active, not just alive. He noticed something curious. A few of the strongest older adults he saw, whether at the park or in videos, had all made some change in their morning routine. Not workouts, not diets, just something small they added. A scoop of powder in their coffee, a shake, a green drink. That tiny curiosity, that quiet moment of maybe I should try, would become the first real turning point in Knox's journey back to strength. It wasn't until a few weeks later, while taking out the trash, that Knox felt something snap. Not a dramatic pop or a fall, just a sharp tug behind his knee as he twisted to set the bin down. He froze, gripping the garbage can for balance, and waited for the pain to fade. It didn't. For the next 2 days, Knox hobbled around the house, stiff and sore, pretending to everyone else that it was just a little cramp. But inside, something felt different, not just in his leg, but in his gut. That moment frightened him more than he admitted. It wasn't the pain. He'd felt worse many times. What scared him was the realization that one small move, something as basic as twisting, could sideline him for days. It made him think of friends who had broken a hip or torn a tendon from a misstep, never quite returning to the life they had before. Knox couldn't stop asking himself, is this how it starts? The thought clung to him like a shadow. He found himself testing his balance at random moments, lifting one foot while brushing his teeth, stepping over curbs slowly, watching his own body like it might betray him again. And then came the second warning sign. He bent over to tie his boot and got dizzy when he stood up. Not a rush of blood, not hunger. It was something else, like his body was short on fuel. Knox sat down on the bed and just stared ahead. He wasn't sick, but he wasn't fine either. That was the moment he remembered something Tom had mentioned. Your body gives you little warnings, quiet ones, before the real trouble starts. And suddenly it made sense. Knox hadn't injured himself. His muscles had simply become too weak to support everyday movements. The scaffolding was still standing, but the bolts were loosening. And if he ignored it, it wouldn't just be a sore knee next time, it could be a fall, or worse. He dug back into the notebook he'd started. This time, he didn't just write memories he wanted to protect, he wrote the things that worried him. Losing balance, feeling cold in the hands, needing to grip furniture while walking. These weren't just signs of aging, they were signals, and his body had been quietly sending them for months. Knox wasn't the type to panic, but he was the type to prepare. So that night, he went online and searched not just for muscle loss after 60, but early signs of weakness seniors ignore. What he found hit too close to home. Stiffness after rest, reduced grip strength, slower walking speed, lack of appetite, low energy despite sleep. These weren't symptoms of sickness, they were whispers of decline. And Knox realized he'd been hearing those whispers for a while. Still, all of this information wouldn't have mattered if it weren't for one phrase he kept seeing: reversible with the right nutrition. Not pills, not surgery, not gyms, just giving your body what it used to make easily, but now couldn't. That was the key. Knox thought about what his doctor had said weeks earlier. Your body might not be using nutrients the same way. And now he understood it wasn't just about eating meat or taking a multivitamin, it was about absorption. His system needed the kind of support that reached deeper, the raw materials to repair, rebuild, and strengthen not just muscles, but the tissues and circulation around them. The more he read, the more one word kept appearing: collagen. Not for skin, not for beauty creams, but for muscle scaffolding, joints, ligaments, connective tissue. It was the glue holding everything together, and Knox hadn't given it a second thought his whole life. But now, he could feel its absence in his knees, in his back, in that small ache behind his shoulder blade that never quite went away. And then he stumbled onto a story just like his own. A retired mail carrier, 70 years old, who had started adding collagen peptides to his morning coffee. After a month, the stiffness eased. After 2, he was walking longer without pain. That did it. Knox didn't need flashy promises or miracle cures. He needed something real, something practical. So he ordered his first tub of collagen powder. No flavor, no frills, just the basics. He stared at the container when it arrived. Could one scoop of powder really make a difference? It felt too small, too easy. But then again, so had the warnings his body gave him. Subtle at first, then louder. Maybe the solution didn't need to be loud, maybe it just needed to be consistent. That evening, he stirred a scoop into his decaf coffee and took a slow sip. Nothing magical happened, of course, but Knox felt something shift, not in his body, but in his mind. For the first time in months, he wasn't just reacting to his decline, he was doing something about it, quietly, steadily, like all the best kinds of strength. Knox had never thought much about protein. Back in his firehouse days, it was just part of the meal. Eggs in the morning, steak after a long shift. He wasn't counting grams or reading nutrition labels. He just ate, moved, and kept going. But now, every scoop he added to his coffee felt like an act of defiance, one small way of reclaiming what time had tried to take away. At first, Knox didn't notice anything. The collagen powder dissolved so easily he almost forgot it was there. No taste, no smell, it was just part of his morning now. But after a couple of weeks, something strange happened. One morning, he got out of bed and realized his knees didn't scream at him. They creaked, sure, but the sharpness was gone. The stiffness had dulled. He moved easier, and most importantly, he noticed it. Maybe it's just in my head, he thought. But even if it was, that was still a win. His mindset had shifted. Instead of expecting decline, he started expecting recovery. Every morning, Scoop wasn't just nutrition, it was a signal to himself. I'm still in this fight. One afternoon, as Knox was organizing the old shed in the backyard, he crouched down to move a toolbox and stood up without thinking. No groan, no pause. He froze, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. That's when he knew something real was changing. Curious, he went back to his notes. He started reading more about collagen, not from marketing pages, but real articles. He learned it wasn't just for beauty, like he once assumed. It was the scaffolding inside the body, supporting not just joints, but muscle too. When muscles contract, it's the connective tissues that stabilize them. Without strong collagen, the body feels wobbly, unstable, like trying to run on sand. He found a study, easy to read, not too technical, that explained how collagen production plummets after 25 and drops sharply again around 60. That made him pause. No one ever told him this, not in school, not at the doctor's office. And yet it explained everything. The slower recovery after yard work, the nagging soreness in his hips, even the long time it took for a simple bruise to heal. And that's when the phrase hit him like a lightning bolt. Muscles don't work alone. It was so obvious, but he'd never thought about it before. Muscles pull, tendons anchor, ligaments stabilize, bones support, collagen holds it all together. So while everyone around him was chasing protein shakes or magnesium pills, Knox had quietly discovered the hidden piece no one talked about. He didn't make a big deal out of it. That wasn't his style, but he started sharing it quietly, first with his daughter. You know, he said over dinner, I've been adding this collagen stuff to my coffee, and my knees don't hate me as much. She raised an eyebrow. Is that all you changed? Knox nodded. That, and I'm paying attention now. Within a few weeks, even his posture looked better. Not dramatic, just steadier, more upright. He could stand and talk without shifting his weight from side to side, could walk longer without glancing around for the next bench. At the grocery store, he picked up a 12-pack of water bottles without thinking and realized, after the fact, that it didn't feel like a chore. One afternoon, while chatting with his neighbor Glenn, a retired school bus driver who had started using a cane, Knox mentioned the powder. Glenn laughed. You getting into that wellness stuff now? But Knox just smiled. I don't know what you'd call it. All I know is I'm moving better. And it didn't take much. Just started with collagen. Glenn didn't laugh the second time. That evening, Knox wrote in his notebook again. Not about fears this time, but milestones. He jotted down, no pain getting out of the car today. Didn't grab the handrail. Played on the floor with Liam for 15 minutes. That last one made him pause, because it had been months since he'd sat cross-legged on the floor and not felt like he needed a crane to stand back up. Now, he did it without thinking. The moment passed quietly, but it was monumental in Knox's heart. Still, he wasn't done. There was still soreness, still fatigue after longer days. Knox understood now. Collagen had been the foundation, but there was more to rebuild. The frame was steadier, but he needed to fuel the muscle itself, not just the structure around it. So like a man preparing to climb the next step, Knox went back to his research. And this time, one word kept appearing. Whey. He jotted it in his notebook with a question mark. He didn't know yet what it would mean for him, but he had learned enough to trust the process. If collagen had helped patch the cracks in his framework, maybe Whey would help rebuild the walls. He took a deep breath, smiled to himself, and underlined the word, whey protein. Knox didn't know it yet, but his journey was about to level up, again. For years, mornings had become a slow negotiation with Knox's body. His eyes would open before the sun crept over the horizon, but getting out of bed wasn't as simple as swinging his legs over the edge and standing up. First came the scan. He'd wiggle his toes, roll his ankles, then bend his knees slightly to see what would complain that day. The worst was the stiffness in his hips and lower back, like someone had poured concrete into his joints while he slept. It wasn't agony, just enough discomfort to steal his ease. He missed the days when he'd bounce out of bed without thinking. These mornings, he'd sit on the edge of the mattress, rubbing his knees slowly, muttering, "Come on, old man, let's move." Then he'd stand with both hands pressing on the mattress behind him for support. Some days it took a few tries, but about 3 weeks into his new morning ritual with collagen, something shifted. He noticed it first when he stepped out of bed and didn't feel that familiar tightness in his knees. His hips weren't locked, his back didn't whine as he stretched. He stood upright on the first try, no hand support. Knox didn't celebrate or call attention to it. He just stood there quietly, barefoot on the hardwood, soaking in the silence. It was the absence of pain that made him pause. That silence in his joints? That was new. That entire morning felt smoother. He moved from the bedroom to the kitchen like he used to, without caution, without calculation. He poured his coffee, stirred in his scoop of collagen, and leaned against the counter with a smile on his face. For once, he didn't feel like his body needed to warm up just to begin the day. Later that morning, he took a short walk around the block. He'd been doing this for years, but with shorter routes and slower strides. This time, Knox picked up his pace slightly, just enough to feel like he was moving with purpose. When he returned home, he didn't need to sit down immediately. Instead, he reached for a broom and swept the patio, something he hadn't done in one go for months. That evening, over dinner with his daughter, she looked at him curiously. "You seem lighter today," she said, tilting her head. "Like your body's moving easier." Knox chuckled. "You could say that. Woke up without my usual joint chorus." She smiled and leaned in. "So, it's the collagen?" He nodded. "I think so. Might be early to call it a miracle, but it's doing something. I'm not stiff anymore, at least not like I was." The next morning confirmed it wasn't a fluke. Same ease, same comfort, no struggle to stand. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, it was subtle, but that's what made it powerful. Knox realized he had spent so many years adjusting to pain that he'd stopped noticing just how much it was stealing from his day. Now, with that pain dialed down, it was like someone had returned a few hours of energy to his mornings. Still, he wasn't naive. Knox knew this progress could disappear if he stopped. That's the thing with aging, it doesn't forgive inconsistency. So he doubled down. He made his morning scoop of collagen non-negotiable, like brushing his teeth or locking the front door. And he began taking gentle walks every evening to keep his joints in motion. Sometimes Liam would join him on his bike, circling around Knox as they chatted about soccer or dinosaurs. One Saturday, Knox even ventured into the local park for the senior Tai Chi group. He didn't know the moves, didn't even plan to stay long, but as he watched them flow, slow, deliberate, graceful, he realized something. Every one of them was fighting the same fight he was. The quiet war against stiffness, slowness, fragility. They weren't there to become young again. They were there to stay whole. Knox stood at the edge, mimicking the movement slowly, feeling the stretch in his back and the gentle pull in his arms. It felt good, real good, not like exercise, more like reconnection. His body wasn't something to battle, it was something to care for. Afterwards, an older woman with soft gray curls approached him. "You moved well," she said kindly. "First time?" Knox nodded. "Just testing the waters." She smiled. "Keep testing. You'd be surprised how much stronger we get when we stop pushing through pain and start giving the body what it needs." That night, Knox sat on his porch, notebook on his lap. He wrote just 4 words. "Woke up. No pain." Then he underlined it twice. For someone else, it might have seemed small. But for Knox, it was a turning point. Not because it meant he was healed, but because it meant healing was possible. And it all started with one decision, one scoop, one habit that honored his body instead of punishing it. Still, he knew there was more work to do. The collagen had helped restore movement and reduce pain, but he hadn't yet addressed the muscle itself. His joints were happier. Now it was time to rebuild the strength around them. That required something different, something more direct. As he read more about recovery and muscle loss, one word kept surfacing in articles, forums, even podcasts: Whey. Everyone talked about it like it was some gym junkie's powder, but Knox saw it differently now. It wasn't about bulk, it was about repair. He wrote it down again in his notebook right beneath his underlined sentence. Next step, whey protein. And just like that, Knox was ready for the next chapter. Knox wasn't the kind of man who joined online forums or commented on videos, but since his journey with collagen began showing results, he'd grown curious to see if others were noticing the same changes. Not influencers or health coaches, but people like him, retired, over 60, dealing with the slow slipping of strength and quietly fighting to get it back. Late one evening, he found himself watching a video titled Whey Protein for Seniors, It's Not Just for Bodybuilders. He clicked, half skeptical, half hopeful. The woman in the video didn't look like a fitness model. She looked like someone he could have gone to high school with. Short gray hair, kind eyes, maybe mid-60s. Her name was Ruth, a retired nurse from North Carolina. She spoke gently, like she was talking to an old friend. I started taking whey protein at 66, she said. Not to get buff, I just wanted to get off the couch without groaning. Knox smiled. That hit close to home. Ruth shared how, after her husband passed, she found herself slowing down, not just emotionally, but physically. Walking up the stairs became harder. Her arms felt too weak to carry laundry. One day, her son, who worked in physical therapy, brought her a big plastic tub of whey protein and said, "Just try this after your walks, Mom. Nothing fancy." She admitted she had doubts. She thought protein powder was for men lifting heavy weights at the gym. "I didn't even know what leucine was," she laughed. "I just knew I was tired of feeling like I needed help with everything." So she started simply, one scoop with almond milk after her afternoon walks. She didn't change anything else. No new workouts, no special diet, just one scoop a day, right after moving her body. Knox listened carefully, intrigued not by her words, but by how she carried herself. Her posture, her ease, the way she described reclaiming her days instead of just feeling better. That felt real, familiar. The same quiet dignity he was starting to rediscover in himself. Ruth said that after about 2 weeks, she noticed her legs felt steadier going up the stairs. Her shoulders didn't sag by the end of the day, and after a month, she carried all 4 grocery bags from the car in one trip, something she hadn't done in years. She laughed, saying, "I stood in the kitchen, holding those bags and thought, look at me, 1 scoop a day." It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. That's what Knox appreciated most. No miracle claims, just a reminder that the body, when given the right tools, knows how to rebuild. He clicked pause and sat back in his chair. Ruth's story felt like a mirror to his own. Different lives, different paths, but the same turning point. The moment you decide you're not going to let your body drift into weakness. The moment you say, "No, I'm still here, and I'm not done." The next day, Knox went to the health store. He stood in front of a long shelf filled with tubs of powders, some bright and flashy, others plain. He read labels, ignoring the ones with strange ingredients or artificial sweeteners. He remembered Ruth's advice. Pick something simple. Look for isolate or grass-fed whey, no junk. Eventually, he found one. Unflavored, clean, 20 grams of protein per scoop. Grass-fed whey isolate. That night, he brought it home, set it on the counter next to his collagen, and took a deep breath. It felt like the beginning of something new. The first morning he tried it, he blended it into a smoothie, half a banana, some frozen blueberries, spinach, a scoop of whey, and unsweetened almond milk. It wasn't fancy, but it was smooth, rich, and surprisingly good. More importantly, it was easy. He drank it, went about his morning, and didn't think much of it. But the next day, after his walk and Tai Chi practice, he made it again. Then again. Soon it became a rhythm. Move, then refuel. Knox didn't expect immediate results, but within 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. He was at the local hardware store helping his neighbor Glenn lift a couple of bags of mulch into the truck. Without thinking, Knox grabbed 1 bag in each hand and tossed them up. Glenn raised his eyebrows. "Dang, Knox, you've still got it." And you know what? For the first time in a long while, Knox felt like he did. That night, as he stirred collagen into his coffee and blended up his whey smoothie, he realized something. Collagen had helped take the pain away, but whey was helping bring strength back. The two weren't competing. They were partners. One restored, the other rebuilt. He smiled, thinking of Ruth, lifting grocery bags and laughing in her kitchen. "Just 1 scoop," she had said. Knox now understood how true that was. One scoop to reduce pain, one scoop to restore muscle, one decision to stop letting age write the story. He took out his notebook and scribbled, "Whey, not for muscles, for freedom." And beneath that, in Ruth's words, just one scoop a day. Knox used to think that rest was enough. After decades of shift work and running on adrenaline, retirement was supposed to be about slowing down, catching up on sleep, letting his body heal itself. But the strange thing was, the more he slept, the less rested he felt. He was in bed by 10, up by 6, but still stiff, still sluggish, still low on energy, well into the morning. One night, after a light stretch before bed, Knox sat on the edge of his mattress and rubbed his calves. They ached, not from overuse, but from underuse. That low, dull tightness that didn't scream, but whispered, "You're not recovering like you used to." He'd felt it after gardening, after walking, even after sitting too long. His body didn't bounce back anymore. It lingered in fatigue. That's when something Ruth said in her video came back to him. Recovery doesn't happen in the gym. It happens in your sleep. He hadn't given it much thought then, but now it made perfect sense. He was finally moving more, eating better, fueling his muscles with collagen and whey, yet something was still missing. That final phase, the repair, the recharge, the night shift that no one sees, but the body desperately needs. So Knox went back to his notebook, pen in hand. What helps recovery at night? He wrote the question, then circled it. The next day, he started reading. Not research papers, just small, easy explanations. And one name kept showing up, casein protein, a slow digesting powder that worked through the night, feeding muscles while you slept. Not for bulk, not for athletes, just a quiet fuel source for older adults whose bodies needed more time to repair. It was different from whey, which digested quickly, perfect for after movement. But casein was the nighttime partner, releasing amino acids over hours, like a drip feed for recovery. Knox liked the sound of that, something that didn't demand effort, just intention. So he added one more tub to his kitchen counter, unflavored micellar casein. He started small, half a scoop stirred into warm almond milk before bed. It had a smooth, milky texture and felt like a gentle way to wind down. No caffeine, no stimulation, just something simple and comforting. That night he slept, the same, no miracle. But when he woke up, something subtle had changed. His legs weren't as sore, his back didn't throb when he sat up. It wasn't dramatic, just enough that he noticed, enough to write it down. Over the next week, he made it part of his routine. Brush teeth, warm milk, stir in casein, sit by the window, watching the street lamps flicker through the trees. Sometimes he'd jot notes in his journal. Sometimes he'd just breathe and let his mind settle. The interesting part, after 5 or 6 days, the changes added up. He didn't just feel less sore, he felt stronger in the mornings. That dreaded first step out of bed was smoother. He no longer grabbed the wall or braced his hand on the nightstand. He walked to the kitchen with steadier feet, less tightness in his ankles and calves. Even his hands, which used to feel stiff gripping the coffee mug, moved more freely. One morning, he caught himself humming while making his smoothie. That was rare. Not because Knox was gloomy, he wasn't, but humming was something he used to do when his body felt light. And now it was coming back, like an old friend returning after a long absence. It made him wonder, how many other seniors are out there thinking they're just getting old, when really they're just under-recovering? That weekend, Knox visited his sister, Mary Ann, who had been dealing with persistent fatigue and sore joints. They sat on her porch, sipping tea, watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes down the hill. She winced slightly when she shifted in her seat. "Sleeping 8 hours and still waking up tired," she muttered. Knox turned to her. "You ever try feeding your muscles at night?" She blinked. "Like what? A midnight snack?" He chuckled. "Not food, just something slow, like casein. Protein your body can use while you sleep." Marianne raised an eyebrow. "You're turning into a nutrition nerd, huh?" "Not really," he said, smiling. "I just started listening to my body and giving it what it's been asking for." That night, Knox stirred his warm almond milk again, watching the powder dissolve. It wasn't exciting, it wasn't flashy, but it worked. That's what mattered. In the morning, he'd write in his notebook, "Woke up rested, legs feel ready." It was the first time in years that his mornings felt like a beginning, not a recovery from the day before. And as Knox took his first steps into the kitchen, joints quiet, muscles steady, something clicked deep inside him. This powder didn't just work while he slept. It gave him back the mornings he thought he'd lost. Knox wasn't sure when exactly the idea took root, that protein powders were only for the young, the muscular, the gym-obsessed. Maybe it was all those ads he used to see, sweaty 20-somethings, veins bulging, lifting weights heavier than a fire hydrant. That image was etched into his mind so deeply that even after he'd started using whey protein himself, part of him still felt like he didn't belong to that club. But one afternoon, as he sat at the local diner waiting for his turkey sandwich, he overheard a conversation at the next table that made him smile. Two men, both around his age, were talking about how sore they felt after raking leaves. One joked, "Guess we need to start lifting weights." The other laughed, "Forget that, I just need to lift my grandkid without throwing my back out." That was it, right there. Knox didn't care about biceps or abs, he cared about function. About being able to reach down, stand tall, carry what needed to be carried, and move through his days with ease. He stirred his iced tea thoughtfully and then pulled out his little notebook. Under yesterday's entry, "Slept well again, fewer leg cramps," he wrote, "Whey is not for athletes, it's for people who still want to live." That thought stayed with him for days. At home, Knox began revisiting the basics. Why did he need whey, specifically? He already had protein in his meals, chicken, fish, even the occasional boiled egg. But he remembered something his doctor had once said. As you age, your muscles don't respond to protein the same way they used to. You need more, and you need it in the right form, at the right time. That's what whey offered: quick digestion, high leucine content, all 9 essential amino acids. In other words, it delivered what his muscles needed right when they needed it, especially after movement. Knox had started to notice that when he took whey after a walk, tai chi, or even doing chores around the yard, he didn't feel nearly as sore the next day. His legs recovered faster, his arms didn't throb at night, his posture felt taller. One afternoon, after mowing the lawn and trimming some hedges, he decided to test something. He skipped the whey shake, just water, a light lunch, and a nap. That evening, the soreness crept in, not awful, but noticeable. The next morning, tight hamstrings, stiff lower back, and a general heaviness in his legs. The day after that, he did the same routine, but this time followed it with his usual scoop of whey, half a banana, and a few frozen cherries in a smoothie. The difference was striking. That night, he didn't reach for the heating pad. And the next morning, his legs felt light again, mobile. That wasn't coincidence. That was fuel doing its job. Knox now began seeing whey not as a muscle powder, but as a recovery tool, just like rest, stretching, or warm water soaks. It wasn't about building size, it was about restoring capacity. He thought of it like putting good oil in an old engine. Sure, the car might be decades old, but with the right care, it could still run smooth. One evening, his friend Glenn came by with a few gardening tools Knox had loaned him. They sat on the porch, chatting about their latest aches like war veterans trading stories. Glenn mentioned he'd been skipping breakfast lately. "No appetite," he said. "Just coffee and toast if I'm lucky." Knox raised an eyebrow. "That might be part of your problem," he said. "You're not giving your muscles anything to work with." Glenn laughed. "Muscles? What muscles? I'm just trying to keep my knees from locking up." Knox went inside, came back with a small glass of a vanilla smoothie he'd made earlier that afternoon. "Just try it," he said. "Whey protein. Quick, easy, and your muscles will thank you." Glenn hesitated, then took a sip. "Tastes like a milkshake," he said, surprised. "Exactly," Knox replied. "And it does more for your body than half the stuff in your medicine cabinet." They both chuckled, but Knox could tell the wheels were turning in Glenn's mind. That night, Knox jotted a note, helping others see whey as support, not a supplement. It felt like a shift, not just in his body, but in his mindset. He wasn't just taking care of himself. He was reframing what care even meant, not pills, not rest alone, but intentional recovery, functional strength. He didn't need to lift weights. Life itself was the weight. Lifting groceries, standing up from the couch, climbing stairs, tossing a ball to Liam. These everyday moments required strength, and Whey gave him the quiet support to meet them. As Knox rinsed his blender cup and wiped down the counter, he smiled at the simplicity of it all. One scoop, once a day, once, and the change it brought wasn't loud, it was felt. more energy in the afternoon, more stability in the knees, more confidence in movement, more of himself coming back to life. And the best part, it didn't matter that he wasn't an athlete, because every time he reached for that scoop, Knox was training for the life he still wanted to live. The first time Knox noticed his arms looking a little firmer, he was reaching up to grab a bowl from the top kitchen shelf. It was one of those everyday motions he'd done 1,000 times, but this time the movement felt easier, cleaner. There wasn't that momentary wobble in his elbow. No joint hesitation, just reach, grab, done. But what really caught him off guard was the reflection he caught in the microwave door as he turned, the faint outline of his triceps. Nothing dramatic, but there, a small ridge of definition he hadn't seen in years. He blinked, looked again. Yep, still there. It wasn't muscle like in the magazines. It was Knox muscle, real, earned, grown not from lifting heavy at the gym, but from carrying groceries, pruning hedges, helping his neighbor rearrange a shed, and, most importantly, consistency. One scoop of whey after movement, one dose of collagen each morning, one warm casein drink before bed. No skipping, no second guessing, just rhythm. He hadn't set out to gain muscle. That wasn't the goal. He simply wanted to feel steady again, like his body belonged to him. But somewhere along the way, that small habit had begun building something bigger. Not just strength, but momentum. It reminded Knox of his firefighting days. Back then, success didn't come from heroic, single moments. It came from discipline, showing up, keeping your gear clean, running drills even when no one was watching. And now, this new routine had the same feeling. Each scoop was a drill. Each walk, a quiet fire he was putting out in his own body before it could spread. Knox started noticing the little wins stacking up, carrying both bags of soil from the trunk without needing to stop. Reaching down to tie his boots without holding his breath. Even walking through the grocery store without scanning the aisles for a bench to rest. These weren't gains in the gym sense, these were life gains, and they meant more than any number on a scale or tape measure. One afternoon, Liam came running up the porch steps with his soccer ball. "Grandpa, come kick with me." Knox hesitated. The grass was still a little wet, and he didn't want to slip. But then he looked at his legs, felt how grounded they were beneath him, and nodded. "All right, let's see if I still got it." They spent 20 minutes passing the ball back and forth, laughing every time Knox misjudged a kick or Liam exaggerated a dramatic goalie dive. When they finally collapsed into the porch chairs, breathless and grinning, Liam looked at him and said, "Grandpa, you're strong again." Knox didn't say anything, just looked at the boy, his eyes stinging just a little from the truth of it. That night, he opened his notebook. The page was nearly full, but he squeezed in one more line at the bottom. Strong again. Not like before, better. Because this strength was different. It wasn't built on adrenaline or ego, it was built on respect for his body, for his time, for his future. And the more he respected those things, the more his body responded. He started walking farther, stretching longer, standing taller, and people began to notice. A neighbor waved from across the street and called out, "You've got a new spring in your step." Even his daughter commented one morning, "You're looking younger lately, Dad. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Knox just smiled and tapped the kitchen counter where his trio of powders sat in a neat row. Collagen, whey, casein, no magic, no secrets, just small habits, stacked daily. And here's what he learned, something he wished he'd known 10 years earlier. The body doesn't demand huge changes, it rewards small ones. But only if you're willing to repeat them, over and over without fail. Even on days when he didn't feel motivated, even when his back felt a little tight, even when life got busy, he didn't skip because he'd come too far to start slipping backward. He'd begun this journey to stop the decline, but somewhere along the way, he started building forward. And that's what surprised him the most. Not that he could feel okay again, but that he could feel better than before. The muscle gains, they weren't in his arms or legs alone, they were in how he stood, how he moved, and most of all, in how he believed in his body again. One morning, while waiting for his coffee to brew, Knox sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a flyer from the local health clinic. On the last page was a short article, "Protein After 60. Are You Getting Enough?" The headline caught his eye. He leaned in, squinting a little to read the fine print. It outlined a surprising fact. Most older adults believe they get enough protein, but they often fall 30–40% short of what their bodies actually need. Not because they don't eat, but because they overestimate the protein in the foods they do eat and underestimate how much more they need as they age. Knox leaned back and exhaled slowly. "That was me," he whispered. Before starting this journey, he thought he ate pretty well. A couple eggs for breakfast, some chicken for lunch, maybe a soup or sandwich at dinner. It felt like enough. He wasn't skipping meals. He wasn't living off junk food. But the numbers told a different story. He remembered something his doctor had mentioned months ago, but that hadn't really landed at the time. As we age, our bodies become less efficient at using protein. So even if you're eating the same amount, you're absorbing and utilizing less. It was called anabolic resistance, Knox had later learned. A fancy term, but a simple idea. Your body becomes stubborn. It doesn't hear the signal from small amounts of protein anymore. You need more, and you need it in concentrated, digestible forms to get the same benefit you used to get effortlessly at 30. No one tells you that, Knox thought. His generation grew up believing that if you had meat at lunch and dinner, you were fine, that a piece of fish or a chicken thigh checked the box. But no one mentioned that a small portion of meat might only provide 15 grams of protein, and that his aging muscles might need 30 grams or more in one sitting just to start rebuilding. And even if the food had protein, it didn't always have leucine, the amino acid that actually triggers muscle growth. Knox remembered Ruth's words in the video again. You can eat enough calories and still starve your muscles. He'd lived that without realizing it. Meals that filled his stomach but left his body undernourished. A plate of rice and vegetables might comfort the soul, but it didn't rebuild the scaffolding his muscles relied on. And over time, that gap had become visible in his posture, his reflexes, and his energy. He reached for his notebook and wrote, "The mistake isn't what we eat, it's what we assume we're getting from it." That afternoon, Knox visited his friend Glenn again. Glenn had been complaining of low energy and aching joints, and now he was starting to skip his usual walks. "My legs just don't recover like they used to," Glenn admitted, rubbing his knee. Knox nodded. "How much protein are you getting in a day?" Glenn shrugged. "Same as always. I have toast and jam in the morning, maybe a sandwich at lunch, pasta for dinner." Knox raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a lot of carbs. Where's the protein?" Glenn looked confused for a moment. "The turkey on the sandwich? Maybe the cheese?" Knox chuckled softly, not in judgment, but recognition. "That's what I thought too. Turns out it's not nearly enough. And the older we get, the more we need. Not just any protein, but the kind your body can actually use to rebuild." Glenn looked skeptical. "So what? We're supposed to eat steak 3 times a day?" "No," Knox said with a grin. "We're supposed to stop pretending toast and turkey slices are doing the job. That's where whey, collagen, and other supplements come in. It's not about eating more, it's about eating smarter." The word supplement still made Glenn wince. Knox used to be the same, but now he saw them as tools, quiet helpers, not magic, not marketing, just concentrated nutrients his body needed to do what it was built to do. That night, Knox went through his pantry and made a mental note of the foods he used to rely on. White rice, crackers, a can of soup, all familiar, all filling, but none of them truly supporting muscle retention. He started being more intentional. A scoop of whey in his morning smoothie, Greek yogurt with almonds as an afternoon snack, a few boiled eggs in the fridge for easy grabs, not because he was dieting, but because he was feeding the part of himself that mattered most now, his strength. And strength, he realized, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in the ease of movement, in the absence of pain, in the quiet confidence of lifting a bag, standing tall, or walking with a steady stride. The mistake most seniors make, thinking that what used to be enough still is. But the body changes, and if you don't change with it, you lose the chance to preserve what matters most. Knox wasn't chasing youth anymore. He was building the strength to enjoy now, fully and freely, and protein, in the right form and at the right time, was no longer optional. It was part of his independence plan. The old walking path behind Knox's neighborhood stretched for nearly 2 miles, winding through trees, past a creek, and around a quiet little pond with a wooden bench. Knox had walked it often during his early retirement, but only halfway, then back again. That had always been enough. He told himself it was fine, that there was no need to push things, but deep down, he remembered a time when he could loop the entire path without a second thought. One crisp morning, with the air just cool enough to make his jacket feel necessary, Knox stood at the trailhead with his thermos in one hand and Liam's water bottle in the other. The boy had gone off with his parents for the weekend, and Knox had the morning to himself. He took a sip, felt the warmth spread through his chest, and started walking. The path felt familiar, like an old friend whose hand you hadn't shaken in a while. The first half-mile was smooth. Knox moved with ease, his steps quiet and even. The soreness in his hips that used to creep in by this point was gone. He didn't think about walking, he just walked. And as the trees opened up and the creek came into view, he realized something remarkable. He wasn't tired, not even a little. Usually by this point, there would be some signal from his body. Tightness in the calves, a need to catch his breath, a subtle urge to turn back before he overdid it. But not today. Knox felt good, grounded, strong. So without stopping, he passed the bench he usually used as a turning point and kept walking. The second half of the loop curved uphill ever so slightly, but Knox didn't mind. He adjusted his stride, slowed just a bit, and kept his focus on his breath. Steady in, steady out. A few birds rustled above him. The creek hummed beside him. For a moment, it felt like time paused. And then, just like that, he made it. He reached the far end of the loop, the wooden sign marking the trail's return. He stopped, hands on his hips, not out of exhaustion, but in quiet awe. He turned around and looked back at the path he'd come from. 2 miles, no pain, no gasping for air, no urge to sit, just energy. As he walked the return loop, a thought echoed in his mind. This is what strength feels like at 68. Not in your arms or chest, but in your breath, your legs, your confidence. It wasn't just the walking, it was everything he had done leading up to it. The powders, the food, the consistency. His body wasn't just recovering anymore, it was responding. Like an old engine finally receiving the right oil, the right tune-up. That afternoon, Knox called his daughter. "Guess what I did today?" he said. She laughed. "Don't tell me you joined a marathon." "Not quite," he chuckled, "but I did the full loop today, the long one. Didn't even feel tired." There was a pause, then her warm voice replied, "Dad, that's amazing." It felt like my body just kept going, he added, almost in disbelief. I wasn't dragging it along, it wanted to move. And that, more than anything, was what had changed. He remembered the days just a year ago when walking the grocery store felt like a chore, when halfway through the block his legs would start whispering, "That's enough." But now, it was different. His legs moved without complaint. His back stayed tall. His steps were smooth. That evening, Knox sat on the porch with his journal open on his lap. He didn't feel the need to write paragraphs, just a few lines. Didn't stop, didn't think about stopping. My legs felt like mine again. He tapped his pen against the edge of the page, staring off into the distance. It wasn't about exercise. It wasn't about breaking records or proving anything. It was about freedom. The freedom to go farther, not because he had to, but because he could. The next morning, he woke with that same quiet energy humming through his body. No soreness, no stiffness, just readiness. He made his smoothie, whey protein, banana, a bit of turmeric, and drank it slowly by the window. The sun rose, soft and golden, and Knox stood watching it, grateful. He understood now that stamina wasn't about willpower, it was about fuel. If the muscles didn't get what they needed, they couldn't carry him the distance, no matter how determined his mind was. That was the mistake he'd made in the past, trying to push through fatigue instead of supporting his body so it could carry him with ease. The supplements weren't a crutch, they were a strategy. He thought about how many seniors out there might be walking half their potential, stopping not because they want to, but because their body doesn't have the fuel to go on. Knox wanted to tell them, you don't need to settle for half the path. You can walk the whole thing. You just need to feed your strength. But instead, he just kept walking. Because sometimes the best way to show people what's possible is to live it quietly, steadily, one confident step at a time. The colder mornings had started to return, the kind where the dew clung to the grass like frost and the windows fogged slightly with every breath. Knox didn't mind the chill, he'd always loved crisp air, but lately, he'd begun noticing something odd. His fingertips stayed cold, even inside. Sometimes his toes too, especially if he sat too long. It wasn't just a passing discomfort, it was a numbness, a quiet signal that something wasn't flowing like it used to. He first noticed it during his daily journaling. Holding the pen, his fingers would feel stiff, as if they were waking up from a long nap. Even when the rest of his body felt warm, his hands remained cool. At first, he dismissed it, just part of aging, he thought. But deep down, Knox had learned by now not to ignore the whispers. That's how the trouble always started. Quiet. A few days later, after a brisk walk, Knox returned home, pulled off his shoes, and saw that his toes had gone pale. Not alarming, but definitely not normal. He rubbed them back to life, frowning. He'd been feeling better in every other way, his strength, his sleep, his energy, but this felt like a new gap. That night, while sipping his warm casein drink, he began reading about circulation in older adults. He learned that as we age, blood flow naturally decreases, not always due to heart problems, but because blood vessels lose elasticity and capillaries don't expand the way they used to. That results in cold hands and feet, slower healing, and even reduced muscle performance. Knox leaned back in his chair, connecting the dots, the soreness after activity that sometimes lingered longer than it should, the tired legs after sitting too long, the cold fingers. All of it pointed to one thing: his circulation needed support. He flipped to a new page in his notebook and wrote a question at the top. How do I boost blood flow naturally? One word kept coming up in his search: spirulina. At first, Knox squinted. Isn't that algae? He muttered. He'd heard of it before, some trendy green powder people added to smoothies, but never paid it any mind. He always figured it was just another superfood fad. But the more he read, the more he realized this little green powder had some serious potential, especially for someone in his shoes. Spirulina wasn't just protein-rich, it was packed with minerals, B vitamins, iron, and most importantly, a compound called phycocyanin. This compound helped reduce inflammation and support nitric oxide production, the very thing that helped relax blood vessels and improve circulation. It clicked in Knox's mind like a puzzle piece snapping into place. If collagen supported the structure, if whey helped rebuild muscle, then maybe spirulina was the missing link that kept everything moving inside, literally. So the next day, Knox stopped by the local health food store. The shelves were lined with colorful jars and powders, but he found what he was looking for: organic spirulina powder, third-party tested, no fillers. He held the green jar in his hand, hesitant for a moment, then nodded. Let's see what you've got. Back home, he opened the jar and sniffed cautiously. Earthy. Not unpleasant, but definitely not neutral like collagen. The label suggested starting with half a teaspoon, so he mixed it into orange juice and drank it in one go. The taste was grassy, but the juice helped. Could be worse, he said aloud to no one, then smiled. Could be a lot worse. He committed to adding spirulina to his routine once a day, usually mid-morning in juice or a green smoothie. The first few days were uneventful, but by the end of the first week, something changed. He noticed it while raking leaves. Normally, after about 30 minutes, his hands would feel stiff and chilled. But this time, even with the cold wind, his fingers stayed warm. Not hot, just normal. His toes, too. And when he sat down later that afternoon, he realized his legs didn't have that heavy, tingling sensation they used to after activity. They felt light, circulating, alive. That night, Knox stood at the sink washing dishes when he realized something else. His recovery time had improved. He'd been more active all week, longer walks, more yard work, but he wasn't sore. His legs bounced back faster. The lingering tightness in his lower back after movement faded. It wasn't magic, but it was real. He flipped open his notebook again and wrote, Spirulina, oxygen, circulation, recovery, warmth. Then underlined it twice. Days turned into weeks, and the green powder became a part of his rhythm. He mixed it into smoothies with banana and pineapple, sometimes with ginger and lemon, other times just in juice and water. The taste? He didn't care anymore. He didn't drink it for pleasure. He drank it because it worked. And every time he wrapped his hands around a warm mug or stood barefoot on the porch without flinching at the cold, he thought to himself, this is working from the inside out. During a family dinner, his daughter reached over and touched his hand. Your hands are warm, she said, surprised. They're usually like ice. Knox smiled. Guess my circulation's back on the job. Seriously, she said. You've changed, Dad. You're sharper, more alive. He didn't argue. He felt it too. That night, before bed, he wrote just one line. From weak to warm to walking strong again. He closed the notebook, stood tall, and turned off the light, his blood flowing, steady and strong. Knox was standing in line at the post office when he noticed something most people wouldn't give a second thought. His hands. They were warm. Not sweaty, not overheated, just warm and comfortable, even though the place was chilly and the man in front of him wore gloves. He flexed his fingers, pressed his thumb into his palm. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like blocks of ice attached to his wrists. It was such a small thing. But for Knox, it was everything, because cold hands weren't just about discomfort. They were a daily reminder that something inside him wasn't moving right, that his body, once dependable and quick to recover, was falling behind, but not anymore. The spirulina had quietly done what no supplement or medication had managed to do in years. It had brought warmth back to his extremities and energy back into his days. He remembered how it used to be, the afternoon crashes, the heavy legs after errands, the mid-morning fog where even reading the paper felt like a chore. It wasn't that he was sleepy, he was just drained, like his battery only charged to 60% no matter how much rest he got. But since adding spirulina, something had shifted. The fog lifted earlier. His feet didn't feel like sandbags. He stopped needing that second cup of coffee at 10 a.m., not because he forced himself to cut back, but because he genuinely didn't need the jolt. He could walk longer without stopping to catch his breath, could stand at the kitchen counter for a full hour prepping dinner, chopping, stirring, washing, without that dull ache in his lower back screaming for him to sit. The fatigue, once a constant low hum in his life, had finally faded into silence. His daughter noticed it first. "Dad, you're glowing," she said one evening as they sat on the couch watching Liam build a tower of blocks on the rug. "You used to be wiped out after dinner. Now you're the last one up, wiping counters and folding laundry." Knox laughed. "I'm not glowing, I'm just awake." "No," she said seriously. "It's more than that. You feel different. I don't know what you're doing, but it's working." Knox thought for a moment, then said, "It's not one thing. It's a bunch of little things. I gave my body the stuff it needed, and it finally started showing up for me again." That night, he sat by his bedroom window, sipping his warm spirulina drink, watching the moonlight cast long shadows across the backyard. He thought about how far he'd come. Just a few months ago, he'd wake up tired, spend the day tired, go to bed tired. He was in a loop of fatigue, convincing himself that this was just what aging looked like. But now the fatigue was gone, and in its place was vitality. He had more mental clarity too. Tasks that used to feel overwhelming, like organizing the garage or doing the week's bills, were now manageable. He wasn't procrastinating as much, not because he'd suddenly become more disciplined, but because his energy supported his intentions. One Saturday, he visited the local farmer's market. It had been years since he'd wandered through it. Usually, he avoided crowds and long walking distances. But this time, he parked far, on purpose, and took his time exploring every aisle. He sampled honey, talked to a mushroom vendor, bought a bunch of dark leafy greens, and when a vendor offered him a spirulina smoothie, he laughed. "Already a fan," he said, raising his hand. He walked nearly 4,000 steps that morning. No cane, no sit-downs, no problem. When he got home, he didn't crash on the couch like before. Instead, he cooked. Chopped onions, sautéed mushrooms, steamed spinach. A simple lunch, but one that he hadn't had the energy to make in ages. As he sat down to eat, something occurred to him. This wasn't just physical energy, it was emotional too. For so long, his fatigue had made him pull back from people, from opportunities, from small joys like grocery shopping or walking through the park. It wasn't depression, it was disconnection, a subtle shrinking of his world. But now, his world was expanding again. He was attending community events, saying yes to more things. He even RSVP'd to a neighborhood BBQ for the following weekend, a small thing, but one he used to avoid, worried he'd tire out too quickly or feel out of place. Not anymore. That night, he jotted down a new note in his journal. "Fatigue used to define me. Now I define my day." He underlined it twice. It was a strange kind of freedom, to not feel ruled by your body anymore. To wake up and know you had the fuel to move, think, laugh, and connect. To walk into the day with certainty, not hesitation. And the green powder, that little scoop each morning, it had become a symbol of something much bigger. Not just circulation, not just nutrients, but momentum. The kind of momentum that carries you out the door, through the trail, into the lives of others, and back home, still standing tall. No more cold hands, no more "I'm too tired today," no more shrinking. Because Knox wasn't getting older and weaker. He was getting smarter and warmer from the inside out. A few days after his farmer's market visit, Knox found himself in the aisle of a small local bookstore. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just browsing, letting his curiosity wander like he hadn't in years. A paperback with a green cover caught his eye. It was called Young from the Inside Out. A little cheesy, maybe, but the subtitle intrigued him. How blood flow determines everything. He flipped it open and started reading. And within minutes, his jaw tightened, not in confusion, but in recognition. Page after page, it described what he'd been experiencing, the role of circulation not just in energy, but in muscle repair, brain clarity, even emotional well-being. But what really stopped him cold was a simple diagram showing something called nitric oxide, a molecule produced inside our blood vessels that acts like a natural expander, helping them widen and relax so blood can flow more easily. The book explained how nitric oxide isn't stored in the body. It has to be produced constantly, and as we age, that production declines. Less nitric oxide means tighter vessels, slower blood flow, colder extremities, delayed recovery, and, in many cases, early fatigue. Knox reread that paragraph twice. The next chapter listed natural ways to support nitric oxide. He smiled when he saw it. Spirulina, right near the top. That small green powder he'd started taking out of curiosity now had a much bigger role in his story than he'd realized. It wasn't just helping his circulation. It was helping his body make something it desperately needed and that no one ever talked about. He bought the book. That night, as he sat in his usual spot by the window, sipping his spirulina drink, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Nitric oxide, a silent little molecule produced deep inside with such a massive impact on how we feel, think, and move. It made sense now, why his recovery had improved, why his hands and feet were no longer cold, why even his afternoon slumps had disappeared. It wasn't magic, it was biology catching its breath. Knox turned back to his notebook, flipping past dozens of pages filled with notes, wins, and thoughts from the past few months. He opened to a fresh page and wrote in bold letters, "Nitric oxide, box your inner traffic light." Below that, he scribbled, "Tells blood where to go, keeps vessels open, delivers oxygen to muscles, speeds up recovery, boosts energy, keeps the brain sharp." The metaphor helped. If his blood vessels were roads, then nitric oxide was the traffic control system, guiding nutrients, oxygen, and energy to where they were needed most. Without it, everything slowed. With it, everything flowed. He thought back to earlier that year when his fingers would go numb just holding the steering wheel for too long. When walking uphill left his legs burning far too soon. When he'd zone out halfway through conversations, not because he wasn't listening, but because his brain felt starved. Now he understood. The problem wasn't just tired muscles, it was tired pathways. And spirulina, in its quiet, unassuming way, was turning the lights green again. The next morning, Knox added a small walk to his routine, not his usual trail, but something different. He mapped out a route with more incline, a small hill just 2 blocks away. He hadn't walked it in over a year. Ever since that one time it left him breathless and sore for 2 days. But today, something inside him said, try again. So he did. It wasn't easy. The hill still demanded something from his legs. But this time, his breath caught up quicker. His calves didn't tighten, and at the top, instead of sitting on the edge of the curb like before, he just stood, breathing, smiling, moving. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, he told his daughter about the book, about nitric oxide, about spirulina doing more than just helping him feel better. She listened, nodding slowly. "So, you're telling me you're rebuilding your blood highways?" Knox laughed. "Exactly. And the traffic's moving again." Later that week, he bumped into Glenn at the hardware store. Glenn looked stiff, shuffling slightly as he walked. They chatted for a bit, and Knox mentioned spirulina again, this time not as a supplement, but as a circulation strategy. He told him about nitric oxide, about how it wasn't about fitness or age, it was about flow, about delivering what the body needed when it needed it. "Let me guess," Glenn said. "All from that weird green powder?" Knox grinned. "Yup, tastes like pond water, works like a miracle." Glenn chuckled, but Knox could see his curiosity had been stirred. That night, Knox stood in front of his mirror and looked at himself, not for vanity, but for proof. And he saw it: the clearer eyes, the steadier posture, the color in his cheeks, the warm fingertips, the calm breathing. He wasn't who he was 6 months ago, and he didn't want to be, because this version of Knox wasn't just alive. He was in flow, with his body, with his energy, with his future. He opened his notebook one more time and wrote, "Circulation is life. Feed it well." And just beneath that, in smaller handwriting, one scoop, one choice, one powerful little molecule. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Knox realized something extraordinary, not because something changed that day, but because something didn't. No aches, no stiffness, no dragging himself to the bathroom, no heavy legs, just a body that felt ready. He walked to the kitchen, still in his slippers, opened the window to let in the soft breeze, and began his familiar routine. One scoop of collagen stirred into hot coffee. One scoop of whey blended into a smoothie. One spoon of spirulina dropped into a tall glass of pineapple juice. No fanfare, just rhythm. As he sipped, he leaned on the kitchen counter and looked out over the backyard. The grass had grown a little long. The hedges could use trimming. There was a time not long ago when that list would have made him sigh. He'd have thought, maybe later, I'll need a nap first. But now, the thought came differently. I'll knock it out after breakfast. That's when it truly hit him. His energy had returned, not in a dramatic fireworks kind of way, but in a steady, reliable hum. The kind of energy that lets you get through the day without needing a nap. The kind that makes you say yes to the walk, yes to the barbecue, yes to life. He thought back to the beginning of the year, to those first moments of doubt and fear, the muscle loss, the weakness, the pain in his knees, the creeping fatigue that made everything feel heavier than it was. He remembered the day he first stumbled, stepping onto the curb, and thought, is this it? Is this the start of the decline? But instead of giving in, he'd chosen to try something small. And now, months later, those 3 small choices had built something big. He grabbed his journal and sat at the table, flipping back through the pages. Each note, each scribble, each underlined phrase told a part of the story. A man who started with pain and slowly, almost quietly, rebuilt himself through consistency, intention, and these 3 unassuming powders. Collagen had given him the foundation. It restored what held him together: tendons, ligaments, joints. He no longer feared standing up from low chairs or reaching down to pick up the newspaper. His frame felt solid, like the house had been rewired and reinforced from the inside. Whey had fueled the engine, not to bulk up, but to rebuild what had been quietly lost. With each scoop, he gave his muscles the signal they'd been missing for years. You still matter. You're still needed. His legs grew stronger, his arms steadier. Tasks like lifting groceries or climbing stairs became second nature again. Spirulina had sparked the flow. Warm fingers, clearer thoughts, quicker recovery. That little green powder had restored something deeper: vitality. The sensation that energy wasn't being stolen throughout the day, but circulating where it was needed. Knox often thought of it as turning the lights back on inside. He smiled, writing slowly across the top of a fresh journal page. 3 powders, 1 life restored. It wasn't that the powders did the work for him. They simply gave his body the building blocks it had been missing. He still walked, he still stretched, he still listened closely to what his body was saying. But now he had the tools and the trust to respond properly. That afternoon, Knox drove out to the park where Liam had a soccer game. The field was crowded with folding chairs, cheering parents, and kids darting in every direction. He carried 2 chairs himself, one for him, one for his daughter, and walked them across the field without needing a rest. No shaking arms, no awkward pause, just movement. After the game, Liam ran toward him and jumped straight into his arms. Knox caught him easily, laughing as he lifted the boy off the ground and spun him once. "Whoa!" Liam yelled. "You're strong again, Grandpa." Knox smiled, hugging him tightly. "I never stopped being strong, buddy. I just needed a little help getting it back." That night, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the lawn, Knox did something he hadn't done in over a year. He went for an evening walk without a destination. No goal, no schedule, just movement for the joy of it. He walked past his old loop, past the bench he used to sit on halfway through, past the incline that once left him breathless, And as the sky turned to gold and the breeze rustled through the trees, Knox felt something deeper than pride. He felt freedom, the freedom to move without pain, to show up for family, to live without fear of decline. And all of it, every step of that journey, had started with one quiet decision: to support his body from the inside out. When he got home, he made one final note in his journal before turning in for the night. Energy isn't youth. It's the reward for showing up for yourself every single day. And with that, he closed the book, turned off the light, and fell asleep, rested, whole, and ready for tomorrow. Knox stood at the edge of the hiking trail, a familiar one just a few miles from his home. Years ago, he used to come here with friends from the firehouse, before the soreness, before the stumbles, before he started questioning whether his body was still on his side. It had been at least 5 years since he'd walked this trail beyond the first bend, but today, he wasn't just there to test himself, he was there to experience the kind of freedom he thought he'd lost for good. The sky above was clear and wide, and the path beneath his feet was a soft mix of dirt and gravel. Knox adjusted the strap of his small day pack, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. No pain, no stiffness. His legs, once hesitant and slow, moved with quiet confidence. As he walked, the ground sloped upward. In the past, this would have been where his knees started complaining, where he'd stop and pretend to admire the trees just to catch his breath. But not today. Today, his legs carried him. And as the trail curved and opened to a small overlook, Knox paused. Not from fatigue, but from awe. The view stretched far. Rolling hills, patches of pine trees, a river glinting in the distance. He stood still, letting the breeze pass over him like a blessing. It wasn't just about strength anymore, it was about freedom. The freedom to go wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without the voice in the back of his mind whispering, "What if you can't make it back?" He thought back to the beginning of his journey, that quiet fear creeping in after the curb stumble, the fatigue that seemed to deepen every week, the mornings that began with stiffness and ended in exhaustion. He remembered how small his world had started to feel, how the front porch had become his boundary line. But now, that line was gone. His world had reopened, and it all began with one decision: to stop accepting decline as inevitable. He sat on a smooth rock near the overlook and took out his water bottle. As he sipped, he thought about the tools that had supported his transformation, not flashy or complicated, just intentional. Collagen had rebuilt the scaffolding beneath his muscles. Whey had fueled the repair after movement. Spirulina had returned warmth and energy to his blood, bringing him back to life from the inside out. And each one wasn't just a supplement, it was a signal, a message to his body that said, "I'm still here, let's keep going." As Knox looked down at his hands, warm, steady, unshaking, he smiled. They weren't the hands of a 30-year-old anymore, but they were strong, capable, alive. Just then, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, light, fast. A couple in their 40s passed by with trekking poles, breathless but grinning. "Beautiful morning, huh?" they said. Knox nodded. "Perfect for a climb." And when they turned the corner and disappeared up the trail, Knox stood again. No part of him doubted he could follow. He began walking again, upward now, and with each step, he thought about all the other men and women out there, sitting at kitchen tables, wondering where their energy went, rubbing sore knees, hesitating at staircases, telling themselves they're just getting old. He wished he could sit beside them, gently put a hand on their shoulder and say, "No, friend, you're not broken. Your body's just been waiting for you to give it what it needs." Aging didn't mean getting weaker, it meant getting wiser. It meant letting go of the myth that pills and passive rest were the only answers. It meant reclaiming the daily rituals that build strength quietly from the inside out. Knox reached the summit a few minutes later, not out of breath, not aching, just present. He stood with the sun warming his back and felt the weight of something else fall away, the burden of fear, the doubt that had once taken root in his chest. He wasn't afraid anymore. He could bend, stretch, walk, carry, and play. He could say yes to walks, to travel, to helping neighbors. He could lift Liam into the air and feel joy, not pain. Back at home that evening, Knox opened his journal. He flipped past the pages filled with aches, attempts, improvements, and victories. And on a fresh page, he wrote, "Freedom isn't youth. It's strength that shows up when you need it most. And now, I've got it back. He capped his pen, turned off the light, and went to sleep with steady legs, a steady heart, and a spirit more alive than it had been in years. Because for Knox, and for anyone willing to take that first small step, stronger legs mean more than strength. They mean freedom. And so Knox's story reminds us of something powerful, something easy to forget as we get older. It wasn't one moment that changed everything. It was a series of small, steady steps, a stumble on the curb, a quiet worry about his strength, a choice to try just one scoop of collagen, then whey, then spirulina, not all at once, not overnight. But day by day, his body began to respond, to trust him again, to rebuild itself from within. Knox didn't become younger, he became stronger. Not because he fought aging, but because he learned to work with it, to listen, to support, and to nourish the body that had carried him this far. He regained his balance, his energy, and most of all, he reclaimed something priceless, his freedom. If you've been feeling tired, stiff, or like your body's slowing down, please know this, it's not too late. You don't need a gym membership. You don't need expensive treatments. You just need to begin one quiet change at a time. Because the path to feeling better isn't paved with pressure. It's paved with consistency, care, and belief. Start with one scoop, one decision to show up for yourself. And just like Knox, you might look back months from now, standing taller, walking farther, and whispering to yourself, I didn't just grow older, I grew stronger. So go ahead. Your next step could be the one that brings your strength back.